Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the office. Today, we're going to be talking about chapters 7 and 8, which are a really good prelude to chapter 9. First, we have to understand how arguments work before we can understand how we counter them, which is what chapter 9 is all about. Now, the last time that I recorded a video for you, I had told you that you didn't need me to read chapter 6 to you, that it was so clear to me. Nobody posted any questions or anything about it, so I'm hoping that means that you read it and you understood. In knowing that, chapters 7 and 8 are pretty much the same. They lay out a very clear path to understanding evidence and also to understanding building arguments from those from premises, from grounds, from evidence, as is stated in chapter 7. Sorry, my notes are that way, so if you see me looking that way, that's why. So let's start with chapter 7, which is talking about grounds for argument. Now, why do we call it grounds? We need good soil and good roots to grow anything, and that's always true with an argument as well. If you think about, I guess, a metaphor or a simile, a comparison, if an argument is like a flower and the better it blooms, the more persuasive it is, then you need to have that flower planted in really good, rich soil, give it plant food, make sure it gets sun and light, and make sure that the roots can grow really, really strong so that the flower itself is going to be persuasive in this metaphor. Well, what we mean by grounds here is quite literal. Grounds is where your reasoning comes from. It's where your claim comes from. So it's literally the base for your argument. So those grounds have to be very good in order to be able to reason out to a persuasive argument. So what do we mean by grounds? Well, one of the things that your book talks about is premises. Now, premises, as you recall probably from the study of syllogism, are the things that come before you make your claim, before you have your conclusion, before your full argument is understood. The thing you're trying to persuade your audience to do or to change has to be grounded really, really well in evidence, as we say. So what are these differences then? Well, a premise can be an artificial premise, as in we have deduced by ourselves without any other external sources of information, maybe from our experience, what we believe all of our agreed upon premises are with our audience. There are, of course, inartificial premises, and that's mainly where we're talking about grounds. So let's first talk about, I've made some offhanded references to certain things that I think also function as premises. One of those is, remember when I was talking about like there's this big cloud of reference out there that we have that we're sort of just like following or walking under, and it's following us around, or all the things that we know. References to history, references to cultural phenomenon, references to foods, references to music, references to all those things where we say, you know what, that generation just doesn't relate to me, or this person cannot relate to us at all whatsoever. All of those things. What is it that our audience has access to that we can be 100% sure or pretty sure that we all agree upon and are able to understand? So a lot of times when I created lectures for argumentation for rhetoric, I started teaching when I was 22. I'm now 48. That's a lot of years in between. An entire generation of people have come and gone in that time. And so my references to music or current events, which were current back then, aren't current now, historical references, my type of music, my enjoyment of certain cultural phenomena, and so on. All of those things impact whether or not you understand the examples that I'm using, the references that I'm using, and why I'm coming to those conclusions. Now, it's really hard for us to assume that the audience is all on the same page that we are, that they have all the same references, that they understand all of the same things. excuse me, I saw a couple of, I mean, a lot of memes are based on this idea of I don't have access to what you have access to, right? Like my point of perspective is very different from others. I lived through the Cold War era. So well, the very tail end of it, let's be fair. Okay. Tail end. But I remember talking about getting under desks. I remember the drills. I remember being fearful of Russia. I remember a musical artist who had a song about Russia. I remember actually several musical artists that had songs about Russia and the United States and the Cold War and the fear of nuclear war. And I'm sorry, but I feel like we're right back there again. All the same. It's not exactly like it was back then. But I suspect that soon we'll have some artists putting out some music about what's going on between the United States and Russia. If you're wondering what I'm referring to, back in the 1980s, there was a song by Genesis called Land of Confusion, which a lot of people talked about that being a reference to the presidency of Ronald Reagan and how old he was, and all these other things. Same things they say about Biden, same things they said about Trump, okay? It's all the same. Arguments very rarely change in the political sphere. However, that song by Genesis, Land of Confusion, is really addressing that issue of how all of us were running around, never knowing if tomorrow was going to come, never knowing if tomorrow was going to be the day, the point when we tip the scales and destroy the world 12 times over. And so we sort of lived in a much faster moving time, in the sense of we were trying to get to where we wanted to be faster without having any appreciation for being present, which really didn't become a thing until the 2000s. So we didn't care about that stuff. We were sort of running around crazy, like in a land of confusion. On the other hand, there was a band in the 80s called The Police. You may have heard of them. Every Breath You Take was The Police. Let's see, Don't Stand So Close to Me, Roxanne. I don't know if any of those songs are ringing a bell, but The Police had a lead singer. That lead singer, his name is Gordon Sumner, but he goes by the moniker Sting. You may have heard of Sting. I don't know. If you have, great. If you haven't, bear with me. He was the lead singer of The Police, and he went on to have a solo career, because they did that a lot back then. And his solo career, of course, has been incredibly good. He's written a lot of songs that are based in sort of the time, the current, the sort of social problems that we're having. And of course, he is, I believe he still lives in London. He's from England. So he writes this song. It's called The Russians. And it's a song that's all about, I think the main line that you need to know is, I hope the Russians love their children too. Meaning that we're not going to press the button. We don't want to kill off the world. I hope they don't want to kill off the world either. And he also makes reference to something that was said by our Secretary of Defense at the time, who was Caspar Weinberger, who said, let's have a small-scale nuclear war somewhere in Europe to prove that we'd win. And it was like, what? I mean, where in Europe are you going to do this? What are you talking about? That Europe is well populated. I mean, this is not something like, it's not Antarctica, I mean, there's a lot of people there. And there he was sitting there going, wait a minute, what are you talking about? There's the United States over here, and there's Russia over here, and you guys are going to do what? And of course, it was called the USSR back then. It was much bigger as an empire back then. So he wrote these songs. Genesis wrote these songs. Those things are accessible to me immediately. So when I'm watching the news and I see news about Putin, or I see news about the Ukrainian war, wow, I can't talk today. The Ukrainian war, and I see, I don't know, all those news stories, they bring back flashbacks and references to those songs. But if I tried to make an argument to you that we should not mess with Russia, And I said, look, this is going to take us back to the 1980s. We're going to be in the Cold War again. There's going to be a real problem. There's the threat of nukes. We're right back where we started with Russia when we had made all this headway between 1992 and 2012, roughly. And you'd be like, what? I don't know what that means, right? So I can't base my argument on the premise that my audience is going to understand what the 1980s were like, what the Cold War was like. I'm going to have to find some other things that might be in your cloud of reference, in your frame of reference, if you will, because not all premises are shared. And being presumptive that we do share those things when we don't can really make an argument fail. What's the word I'm looking for? Bigly? I mean, huge. Well, we're talking massive failure here. A spectacular failure, because you've lost your audience. You have no common ground with them. So finding examples, finding statistics, and finding testimony are very different from just the premises from which we function. And they're very different from just saying that premises are assumptions and evidence. They're really not, but they're definitely a part of the ground that we need to create, to use. And like I said, we need to be careful with presumption of understanding, but we also need to be able to find those points of reference in order to make a really good premise as the grounds for the argument we're trying to make in order for it to be successful. The next one that they talk about at Undergrounds is examples, and I think that's probably pretty clear cut to you. Now, examples, much like any other premise that I was just talking about, those examples need to be obviously relatable for your audience. That this one is not hard to understand at all whatsoever, because I probably just gave you a bunch of examples, and granted, it took me a long time to explain them. I think it took 5 minutes for me just to explain the storyline I was trying to tell you. That is not a quick premise to function from. It's not a quick ground, a quick example for us to reason from, right? There was a lot of explanation, but if I use other examples, let's say more recent examples or more commonly known and understood examples, then you would probably be able to follow me. So I don't want to say this is just like going back to the 60s, the 80s, 2011, none of those things, or 2001, excuse me, none of those things are going to reach anybody anymore. And this, by the way, was not a lesson that my teachers learned, because I remember being in school and people making references to the 60s and the 70s, and I'm just like, oh dear God. In college it was the 90s for me. So I know some of you weren't born until after 2001, but we always have this tendency to ground our premises in things that we believe to be true and universal. Examples are not true and universal all the time. Okay, they're not true anymore, or they're not true in the experience of the audience that we're talking to. So we have to be really careful about choosing those. Now let's talk about statistics, because the thing that bothers me the most is when people say, I don't have any evidence in here. And what they really mean is that they don't have any statistics in there. That does not mean you don't have evidence. That means you don't have mathematical quantifications of statistics of evidence. So we all know that statistics are, I'm fine, I promise. Statistics are a specific type of evidence that we may use to make our argument. It is a quantifiable statement of that is used as evidence. So, for example, 1 out of 3 Americans are satisfied with the economy. That's so untrue. But it would be a statistic, right? Not just because there's a number associated with it. Like if I say there's 12 books on the shelves, that does not constitute a statistic, really. That is just a statement. Instead, quantifiable means that we have to be able to reason it out. So the conclusion that I'm drawing, that 1/3 of Americans are happy with the economy, I am dreaming. I know that, has to be reasoned from other numbers. So statistics are quantifiable and they're used to reason, but they are not reason in and of themselves. Testimony from others. Now, this one is always fun because people think that testimony has to be a direct quotation from an expert witness on a stand in a courtroom, and that's not completely it. We use testimony a number of different ways. Anytime that you read, the warnings from the FDA or from the FDA mainly on the side of a prescription bottle, those are all testimonials. I don't know if you know this or not. I always joke about this relationship between testimonials and statistics because in order to, let's say, for example, talk about side effects of a particular drug or medication, there is always an exception or multiple exceptions to the general symptoms, the side effects that you might experience. And my doctor and I always joke that, my pharmacist sister-in-law told me a long time ago, don't ever read the inserts that you get with your prescription meds because you don't want to convince yourself into getting nauseous or getting a headache or getting, muscle spasms because that's a potential side effect. If you really dig into the numbers, and if you're a person who likes statistics, and I myself am a person who likes statistics, I will dig into the numbers and find out, okay, 3% or less of people who took this drug have this side effect. Okay, what are the odds, right? Literally they're 1 in 97, right? The odds aren't great. Not more than that, actually. I just did that math really wrong. But I know that it's a very small chance. It's almost infinitesimal, not quite, but it's getting there. Here's the thing though, I tend to get every side effect of every medication ever in history. Like even the ones that are like a chance of 1 in, to give you an example, I had gone in and had a surgery done and, the doctor I was working with, checked me out a week after the surgery and said, oh man, we're gonna have to go back in and do this surgery again. There's no way in hell that this is what's happening for real because the fact of the matter is that if this was real, you'd be on the floor crying for your mom in pain. So clearly it's not this thing. It's not condition A, it's condition B. And I was kind of like, okay, what do I know? My doctor is the expert who is giving me his experience, his expert opinion, right? And so I believe him and I go away for about 4 days. And I end up with a fever of 105 and nobody can figure out what's going wrong. I'm immediately admitted to the hospital. And at 5 o'clock the next morning, my doctor comes in the room and he is livid. And I'm like, what are you so mad about? He goes, do you realize that this happens to like 1 in 70,000 patients? That, this occurred in you, that, this condition A was actually happening. There's no way it could have been because you weren't saying you were in any pain, you were walking fine. And I was just like, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to not feel pain. It was a very weird experience for both him and me because if I had read 1 in 70,000 people experience this side effect, I would have been like, okay, well, that's not me. But it happened. So I have stopped reading the side effects because I don't want it to be psychosomatic, right? I don't want to look at it and say, oh, well, that must be true. Now, what does that have to do with statistics here in an argument? Well, what it suggests is that we have to be pretty careful with the way that we handle statistics. We have to know what they truly mean. Is it true that 1 in 70,000 people have that condition occur? I don't know. It sounds right. I mean, it makes sense to me because it was a flaw in my body. And maybe 1 in 70,000 people have that flaw, but we don't really know, do we? We're making a guess based on what we do know that might apply to the general population the same way. When I was first diagnosed with a chronic condition called sarcoidosis in 2009, I was told that black men and black women and Scandinavian men get this disease. I am neither a person of color, nor am I male, nor am I Scandinavian, like in any way, shape, or form. So obviously, the research over the past 13 years or so has changed. We know differently now. We know that there's a lot of middle-aged white American women getting it as well. It's also expanded a great deal. But at first, they don't want to diagnose you with something that they think statistically is not probable. And my final example for this, see, I'm doing examples and statistics at the same time. I was 31 years old and I was living in Minnesota and I was so sick. I think my boyfriend at the time called me General Palpatine, or not General, Emperor Palpatine from Star Wars. If you get that reference, I was very pale. I looked very sickly. I was like half dead, it felt like. And I went in to see several doctors over the course of about 7 weeks. I saw probably 3 different doctors. Kept going for another opinion, like, help me out here. And they would put me on one antibiotic after another, and nothing was working. And finally, I went to the emergency room one night because I literally couldn't breathe out of my nose at all. And it was extremely painful and difficult. And so I went in and I was asked, is there any chance you're pregnant? I said, I don't know. Probably not, but I don't know. And so they took a blood test. Okay. Great. Why did you need to do that? Well, because we need to do an x-ray of your head. We're afraid there might be a brain tumor in there. What? What do you mean an x-ray of my head? No. We think there's a blockage in your nose. That's why we need an x-ray of your head. I said, okay. So they go in and they put me into a skull x-ray, which was interesting. And it comes back. And so I'm sitting in a room waiting for the doctor to come back. And he comes in and he's laughing. I mean, literally, he's laughing at the papers that he's looking at, clipboard and the whole deal. And I said, what's funny? And it sounded more like, well, that's funny, because, good talk time. And he said, you have mono. And I went, okay. He goes, have you ever had mono before? I said, no. Managed to avoid it. He goes, yeah, you have mono. And I was like, then why are you laughing? He goes, because you're not supposed to have mono. And I imagine the reason why you haven't gotten an answer is because people over 30 don't get mono. And I'm like, I'm a year over 30. And at the time, I think it was like a year and a month over 30. He's like, yeah. So doctors kept assuming it wasn't mono. So they didn't test for it. Because despite having all those symptoms, they just figure that a 31-year-old would never have mono. Now, I don't know what makes people think that at 31 years old, mono just goes, yeah, I don't want you anymore. That's not how that works, like, at all. And so if they had not taken that blood for a pregnancy test because he wanted to do an x-ray, we would have been in real trouble because they kept giving me antibiotics. And if anybody knows anything about mono, it's the more white blood cells you have, the worse off you are. And we just kept making my body produce more. So it was pretty rough. All of those are examples. And they use statistics to prove that statistics are not always right. And furthermore, it's testimony, right? I'm giving you my personal experience as testimony. So all 3 of those work as grounds for an argument that you might make that you never listen to a doctor. I'm just kidding. For the most part, generally, the statistics that we have tell us something that we need to know. Generally, it's something that we need to know and something that we can rely on. Is it always 100% correct? No. Are we always 100% correct? No. Is my experience exactly the same as every audience member's? No. And that's the reason why we need to be careful with the grounds that we use. Okay? So hopefully that all sort of helps you out a little bit. Chapter 8 talks about building arguments. And one of the first things that they do is start with the research plan. Now, you might be thinking, why is there a plan on how to do research? And the answer for that's pretty simple. What do we mean by research? What do we mean by sources? How is that different from evidence? Well, we do research to find external or inartificial proofs by looking at scientific, quantifiable, repeatable data that we get by doing research. Okay. Now, most of us don't go out and research every single part of a speech that we're giving or an argument that we're making. That would be impossible. So we rely on other people's resources, right? We rely on other people as sources of information. Now, who we rely on for sources of information, I'm always asked, how do we determine the credibility of sources of information? Well, there used to be a good way to tell the credibility of a source, but nowadays people like to make an argument in the public sphere, in public discourse, argument that comes from traditional modes of sourcing are considered elitist and overly educated and not understandable by a majority of the population. And quite frankly, I find that demeaning. I find that insulting. And it kind of hacks me off a little bit, to be honest with you. Not because I do research and therefore I'm called an elitist. Not because I use traditional forms of research and therefore I'm called an elitist, but because I don't think the general population, all of you or all of America, is that dumb. I 100% believe that statistics, research that's well backed by sources, by historians, by experts in the field, by good examples, and so on, is not elitist. It's the way we all talk, actually. Every narrative that we tell others, even when we're not trying to make a point, even if we're not trying to make an argument, even if we're not trying to be persuasive, every story we tell is testimony from us or from ourselves, or it's an example or both. It's a type of evidence for our audience, whether that's an audience of one other person or a large mass, appeal. So why do we need a research plan then? Well, because it's important to understand how we sort of prioritize the quality of our sources. Okay, that's how I'm going to put this. So traditional forms of sourcing of evidence that I'm used to is interviewing experts, which your book talks about, academic research. So, I think in the book they talk about it in terms of specialized and generalized evidence, and this is specialized evidence that's specific to the field of study. So if I'm talking about the biology of a frog, I need to look at biology journals and books and scientific biological stuff, right? I'm certainly not good enough to say, hey, I'm an expert in this because I have a PhD. No, nothing about the biology of a frog. Not a whole lot. Okay, so it's, and I have to apologize to my poor biology teacher in college who pushed me through the class with a nice solid D+, because he studied frogs. That was his thing. So that's, I'm sorry, Dr. I don't remember his name. I can see his face in my mind's eye, but I've forgotten his name. But I feel bad because he spent an entire semester trying to teach me about kidney functions in a frog, and I'm just like, I have no idea about kidneys in a frog. It was crazy. So I think it was kidneys in a frog. I'm just realizing now they may not have kidneys. There we go. That's how much I learned. And I'm clearly not an expert. So I would have to do a lot of research, a lot of digging. And I would need to have a plan about what sources I wanted to go to, what order I wanted to go to them in, and how to prioritize good research that I can relate to my audience versus the research that is good but doesn't quite match up to the level of scientific certainty that I want it to. versus stories and testimony that may or may not be relatable, and statistics that may or may not be able to be explained. So I'm going to walk through my interview experts. I'm going to go to my academic sources. Most of us don't go interview experts. I don't know why the book talks about that. That's just not really something that a lot of us do. It's something that research does sometimes, or like if you're writing a book or a novel, but for the most part, we don't do that. But we do look at academic sources a lot. I mean, you hear your professors tell you regularly, I'm pretty sure, that you need external sources. You need so many resources or references for your paper. What fascinates me about a number of references required for your paper or your speech is, how do you know that 5 resources is enough? Or that 5 resources isn't just overloading and overbearing? How do you know? We don't know. So I always say, use as many sources as you need to make the argument well. So if you're not an absolute expert, recognized as an expert in a particular field, and you're giving this speech, you better have some outside sources, some external sources to you, right? Because that's the only way to make your argument. So academic journals and books tend to provide some of that for us. If we're talking about something about social policy, public policy, legislation, or particular law, then we need government resources. But you don't need government resources all the time. In fact, it's very rare that I'll actually turn to a government resource. And what do I mean by that? I'm talking about not just like a Library of Congress. I'm talking about government documents and policies, and the way a bill becomes a law, which is a great little Schoolhouse Rock reference, if you know Schoolhouse Rock, which you may or may not. Government documents aren't really something that you go to a whole heck of a lot in any type of debate, be it academic or, I mean, sometimes an academic debate, but not in general debate, in public discourse. Your book labels the internet. I'm sorry, I have a hard time with this. As someone who predates the internet by many years, I first experienced the internet when I was in college. My sister was in college, so it would have been 1991. She had an email at the University of Pittsburgh. And I was like, okay, well, I don't know what that is. You know, when I got to college, I got an email. Now, the internet is just that system that's interconnected of, it started out with just email. We didn't get to like databases of information until a lot later than that, or a little later than that, a couple years. Things move so quickly in the past couple decades, to be honest with you. The internet is not the same as the web. The web is not the same as the internet. The web is part of internet activity. Most people can tell you that the web is not the only language out there to use internet with. I am reminded every single day when I wake up that my husband and I met on the internet. We did not meet on the web. There were no pictures involved. We played an international interactive game of Dungeons and Dragons that was text-based. So you know how in like World of Warcraft or some of those fantasy games that you may or may not be familiar with, where you could see a picture of somebody like running and then they battle, that whole thing? Yeah, that didn't exist back then. It was walk north. And there would be this whole text, you walk north into this area and a dragon has attacked you, or whatever. And he and I both played that game. And I think the game was actually based in Brazil, because at the time we didn't have computers in the US that the public had access to, that we could utilize for gaming. And that's why I almost failed out of college, folks, just so you know. So that was the internet. We used something called Telnet. There was a different language. I think it was called ASCII, ASCII, if I recall correctly. And now we use something different. So what do we mean by getting sources from the internet? Most of the time we mean from the web. Okay. And there is a big difference between a web resource and an online resource. And here's or an internet resource and an online resource. Let me explain. An internet source is, generally speaking, from the web. It's usually from an unaccredited or not necessarily an expert in a field, and they're talking about something and they share their opinion or they share what they claim to be research. That type of stuff is a web source, an online source, an internet source. Or not online, a web source or an internet source. An online source, just so this is how I refer to it. I don't know that everybody does this, so clarify. This is a Dudashism right here. An online source is a source that is made available online to you, but that is originally intended to be in print. So, for example, I always try to tell my 350 class this too. Whenever you're looking for, I don't know, let's say Aristotle's work on argument, it's not that hard to get it. You go online to the web, and usually you use a resource or a database that you know is good. Some of us use other databases, but I always start with the Missouri State Library system, right? Because the online catalog at the library, I know, only has edited books, and I know only has edited journals, and I know only has, when I'm looking at least, only has like things that I would qualify as good sources of information. Obviously, I'm not in the fiction section. Obviously, I'm looking mostly at journals. Okay, so I use JSTOR a lot. Now, EBSCOhost is the name of our database, not the name of a source. You did not get something from Missouri State's libraries, online systems. You did not get something from EBSCOhost. You did not get something from LexisNexis or JSTOR or something like that. You have a source that was originally probably in print or intended for print that was made available to us online. Aristotle's works, Socrates' works, how do you think we get them? Do I read a book anymore? No, I've got all my books right here behind, well, not all of them, but I've got some books here behind me. And then I've got a whole storage room that direction behind this wall that is just books. Because back in the day, we had a lot of books and we had to haul them around. I understand now, like I was talking to my stepdaughter about this, they don't carry backpacks anymore. They don't have lockers. They just have their Chromebook. I'm just like, what? What is happening? They don't have homework anymore. Mind blown. I'm not a big fan of the no homework thing. But you know, they don't have to think about anything post 3:30 in the afternoon or whenever they get out of school. But they could sit down on the internet and read some things. And so I have her signed up for the Kindle app so that we can share books with her and watch what she's reading and read along with her because she doesn't go to the library in Arkansas or anything where she lives most of the time. So that's how I share books with her. And that leads to the next type, which is books. Okay. Books are a thing. They still exist. People carry them around. If you want to go and sit in a library and look at books, please do it. One of the reasons why people ask me a lot, why did you get your PhD? I ask myself that question every day. But I think not the main reason, but one of the benefits of getting my PhD was that I loved the smell of old books and old paper. And I used to go to the library at Mizzou and just sit in their like old creaky metallic like steps and cages section and dig up all these books that were dusty and barely had been used. Because, you know, most people don't read academic journals for fun. And I loved the smell and the process of that. It sounds weird. I'm sorry. I know. Some people like diesel or cigar smoke. I like old paper. So I would also go to a section of the library based on the decimal system that we use, or the Library of Congress number, or whatever you guys call it these days. And I would just find the section that had the books on a topic I was interested in, political communication, or civility or whatever. And I would go to that book and just look at all the books surrounding it because they're arranged by topic. So just sit there and just read those books, pull them out, glance through them, see what I wanted to use. So if you are a bibliophile like I am, go to the library and sit down and read some books. But the internet makes it possible for us to not have to do that anymore. You can sit in the comfort of your own home and read all the books you want, which is fantastic. In building arguments, of course, you have to cite your sources of information. I don't think that's anything new to you. So it talks about how to do that in an argument. We need to know where your sources are coming from, because we evaluate arguments based on credibility. I know you don't believe me because in the public sphere, it doesn't seem that way. But in really good argumentation, we base our information on sources that are credible and reliable. And this is true whether you watch Fox News, MSNBC, C-SPAN, read the Irish Times, read your local paper, listen to one professor over another. It doesn't matter. You're always evaluating the credibility of your source. And when you're watching a news program like that, I shouldn't say news programs. What are those things? Entertainment? Like Tucker Carlson and what's that? And Rachel Maddow. Like, let's just say those two, okay? Because they're very diametrically opposed. When they bring guests on, they list their credibility. When they bring guests on, they might talk about a book they wrote or what experience they had. That is establishing that guest's credibility for you to evaluate whether the argument is good or not. Okay? All right. Last but not least, it talks about how to organize your argument. And this is actually something that's actually pretty important. I'm going to add a little bit to it by just saying, in addition to what your book tells you, that you can organize an argument in such a way that it leads your audience to believe you more. You're more, you persuade them more, you persuade better with a certain organization to your argument. And that organization changes depending on your audience, depending on what argument you're making. When I'm talking about how to properly bake Czechoslovakian desserts, for example, I don't know where that came from. I guess I'm craving some Czech cookies or something. If I'm talking about that, I may want to start with a description of my experience with those cookies and how amazing it was before I get into here's how to properly make them, or historically how they've been made, and citing sources all over the place about that. Another example that's probably a little bit better, to be honest with you, is that sometimes we're talking to people who need evidence first and argument second. So evidence first and claim second. So they need you to, quote unquote, lay the groundwork. Literally give me the grounds from which I'm supposed to reason, and then walk me through that reasoning. The point is, at every turn, an argument should be organized in such a way that the conclusion or the claim is not unexpected. Because if you walk a person to a particular conclusion, be it that you start with the conclusion or you start with evidence, walking them to that conclusion and explaining it reasonably should not be that difficult. This, by the way, does not in any way reflect on the truth or the veracity of an argument. I'm just telling you how to make the best one. So I sort of sound like a sophist. Like, the truth is irrelevant. Let me just make a really good argument for you. Because we can, as somebody said, there's a statistic for everything, right? Or 72% of all statistics are made up. There you go. I'm not citing those because that's clearly just a crazy, those are just crazy thrown out there examples of things that that probably aren't true. but I can make them sound true if I want to. I think that my mother once said to me, she's like, you and your father, you could swim through a river of mud and come out on the other side clean. I don't think that was a compliment, by the way. I don't want to be seen as a liar or someone who bends the truth. But if we listen to people like Plato, and some others who throw the word rhetoric around a lot without really meaning its traditional meaning, but using the idea that it's just empty, flowery, lying, talk out of both sides of your mouth language. I hate to be that person. Can I tell you how to do it? Absolutely, 100%. But should you? No. Just because you can does not mean you should. So there's an ethic here to utilizing proper source material. In other words, to use proper evidence in a way that helps your audience come to the conclusion that you do and still tell the truth. And I know that's hard to believe, but it is very, very, very possible. And just by reading chapters 7 and 8, we can see how that is possible. We can also see the flaws. But for the most part, for today, we're going to focus on the positive of utilizing grounds, evidence, and utilizing organization, pattern of reasoning to draw a conclusion as our most persuasive, as our tool, our best tool for being persuasive. All right, everybody, I hope that helps a little bit, or maybe it just adds confusion. I'm not sure. Let me know either way. Hopefully they're supplemental and I'm not just reading the book back to you, but hopefully you're reading. Hopefully this is helping. And if you have any questions, as always, talk to me soon. I will be grading or I shouldn't say be grading. I've been grading your tests. I've been waiting for one more to come in. Somebody had a family emergency, and normally I don't post grades until I have them all. But I may be posting those grades tonight or tomorrow instead. So you'll get them very, very soon. I'm pushing that 2-week mark a little too far, I think. Meanwhile, keep reading. Next chapter is chapter 9, and we'll be dealing with that next week. Then we have chapter 10, and I believe we have another exam coming up after that. So I definitely want to make sure I have your graded exams for you very, very soon. All right, everybody, have a good one.